Welcome to Salty Slumber Stories, where we set sail on the misty waves of Newfoundland's lore to ease you into Dreamland's harbour. Tonight we embark on Newfoundland and its untrodden ways, a timeless 1907 travel and hunting saga penned by British naturalist, artist and explorer John Gillet-Millet. It charts his voyages through the island's wild heart caribou herds, thundering across barrens, brushes with beasts, and yarns spun with hardy locals and Mi'kmaq guides amid fog-shrouded forests and roaring rivers. To my beloved grandmother, Freda Stroud, a true Newfoundland spirit who could track a moose through the untrodden barrens, cast a line into the wildest waves, lose herself in the pages of a cherished book, lift her voice in song amid the storms, and embrace life's rugged beauty with unyielding grace. You introduced me to these stories of our homeland, and in every word I hear your wisdom. You are my eternal role model, guiding me like the steadfast lighthouse on a foggy shore. This reading is for you. Chapter 1. Into the Terra Nova Country. The Indians say that when Manitou, the Great Spirit, was making the continent of the New World, he found that he had much material left over in the shape of rocks, swamps, and useless trees. So he formed a big rubbish heap by casting it all into the sea to the northeast and called it Wisokadao. Several years after, Cabot discovered and claimed the island for Great Britain when it was called Newfoundland. The world in general knows little of Newfoundland, and the average Englishman imagines it to be a little bit of a place somewhere near the North Pole, which, with 2 or 3 other colonies, could be safely stowed away behind the village pump. If he has been to school, he will have learnt that it is our oldest colonial possession, famous for codfish, caribou, and national debts. To him, the island is inseparably connected with fogs, dogs, and bogs, just as he imagines Africa to be a mass of lions mixed with sand. Should he wish to be still further enlightened as to its size, he will find that one cannot watch seals in the Straits of Belle Isle and walk down to tea at St. John's on the same day. In fact, it is 1/6 larger than Ireland and has an area of 42,000 square miles. Moreover, it may be of interest to know that the Newfoundlanders are not black or red, but are of a good old English stock, and that they wash themselves twice a day. In reality, Newfoundland is a most attractive place, with its thousands of lakes and pools, picturesque streams teeming with salmon, trout, and ouananiche, great open moors and marshes dotted with the ever-restless herds of caribou, a wild sea-coast inhabited by thousands of seabirds, dense forests of varied and beautiful trees, all contribute to make the island one of the most delightful of all wild countries to the sportsman and the lover of nature. There is more than a little fascination, too, in knowing that here is land within 7 days of England, a great part of whose interior has never been trodden by the white man, even by government surveyors, and that you can plunge into this beautiful wilderness and feel all the delights of wandering at will through the recesses of an untrodden waste, where deer stalking and such deer too may be pursued. It is perfect because you can do it all by yourself and not trust to your guides for this part of the hunt, as the Newfoundlanders, though excellent fellows, are not well versed in the finer points of the art of venery. Here in these forests and barrens with their natural sanctuaries, the caribou are holding their own, one of the few instances where the purely wild game of Europe and America are not decreasing. With the exception of some of the large animals, Newfoundland contains much the same fauna as Canada. The black bear is still to be found there. Wolves are very rare and lynxes increasing. The principal animal, however, which is of interest to the hunter and naturalist is the woodland caribou, Rangifer tarandus terrae novae, which is still exceedingly abundant in spite of the persecution to which it is subjected. For its size, Newfoundland possesses more of these animals than any other part of the world, and, owing to the nutritive qualities of its super excellent caribou moss, the deer grow to a size and in some respects throw out finer horns than any other form of the reindeer in existence, if we accept those of British Columbia, Alaska, and Labrador. In the autumn of 1900, my friend, Mr. F. C. Sellis, the well-known hunter, being disappointed of what he saw of the annual Howley bombardment, made an expedition into the center of the island, more as a sort of preliminary canter for a future visit than in the hope of catching up the migrating caribou, for which he had arrived too late. He was told that no one could get any distance into the interior owing to the difficulty of carrying food, and that he would be certainly get bogged before he had gone far. But difficulties of this kind presented no obstacles to a man who has spent his life in overcoming them. So getting 3 men who were willing to follow him, he started off from Terra Nova in the middle of November. The tramp was assuredly a hard one, but it was not undertaken in vain. He killed one nice stag and found certain signs in the interior near St. John's Lake that convinced him of the existence of a southern herd, whose presence was unsuspected by either sportsman or naturalist, and which never journeyed north in the spring. On this expedition went one Robert Saunders as packer, a thoroughly reliable man, whom he engaged to visit this ground the following autumn, if it were possible to ascend the Terra Nova River with canoes. So in the September following, Mr. Sellis again went to Newfoundland, and after some trouble reached St. John's Lake, where he had excellent sport, killing all his 5 stags, one of them a splendid 42-pointer, in 1 week. He saw but few deer, as the migration out of these east-central forests had only just commenced, but told me he believed that if I could get farther into the country to the west, which was quite unknown, I should probably strike the main trails of a big southern herd. All of this reasoning proved to be quite correct. Mr. Sellis kindly engaged Robert Saunders and Jack Wells for me, the 2 men who had traveled with him, and he spoke of them in the highest terms. Only those who have been a journey or 2 to distant lands know how important it is to have the very best men in an expedition of this sort, for there are 100 occasions where just a little extra determination and just a little hard work are necessary to ensure success. I arrived at St. John's on August 23. Mr. Reed of the Newfoundland Railways came to meet me and offered me every assistance in his power. Next day, Mr. Withers, a friend I had met in the boat coming out, introduced me to Mr. T. Murphy, the president of the Marine and Fisheries Department, and from him I received a permit to collect for scientific purposes such specimens as I required, an unusual concession on the part of the government for which I was most grateful. St. John's is a quiet old-world place, something between a Canadian town and a Norwegian fishing village. On one side of the beautiful harbor are endless cod flakes and a few sealing vessels, and on the other is the main town, built on the side of a steep hill where electric trams and lights add the one jarring note. But the whole atmosphere of the place is charming and without noise. They discourage the American spirit there, and the man who wants to hustle soon breaks his heart. Businessmen stroll down to their offices at 10 o'clock and have always time for a cigar and chat. Life is very much as it was 50 years ago, with the addition of a few innovations which the people have been powerless to prevent. At the summit of the hill are splendid churches which seem to give a certain tone of distinction to the place, and at the back of these are the houses of the more affluent. Beyond this we find agricultural scenery amid rolling hills, and still farther, but not too far for a walk, are dense fir woods of peace and beauty. St. John's is really a charming city viewed from a distant spot such as the veranda of Judge Prowse's house, and after several visits I was never tired of this landscape. But to return to the city, the main thoroughfare is Water Street, where the traveler can obtain anything within reason. The shops are excellent and up to date, and the people extremely kind to strangers, especially when they come from the old country. The cabs are a feature of the place, and are drawn by wiry little Canadian horses. When you go up the steep hills, you feel you ought to be prosecuted for cruelty to animals, and when you come down, you wish you had never been born. You drop from the cathedral to Water Street in one horrible swoop, scarcely reassured by the optimism of the Placentia Irishman who drives you, and who always makes a point of conversing at the most hair-raising corners. "Och, slip is it," he says. "Sure if she was going down the sides of hell itself, she'd never put a foot wrong at all. Kim up." In proof of which confidence in his steed, Bucephalus is urged to greater exertions. If you ask a policeman a simple question, he will not kill you with his club, and even the tram cars are not run for the express purpose of murdering absent-minded strangers as they are in New York. Life, in fact, is quite safe as long as you keep clear of the accommodation train and hurt pie. I have mentioned hurt pie as a danger to the traveler because at every meal you get hurt pie, and it is so horribly good that many helpings are sure to follow in rapid succession to the ultimate ruin of one's digestion. The daily papers are very funny, especially their items of local news, and, it need hardly be mentioned, a deadly enmity exists between the rival editors. Nevertheless, they have several men in St. John's who have done and are still doing excellent press and magazine work on subjects relating to the people of Newfoundland, notably Mr. P. T. McGrath of the Herald and Judge Prowse. The articles of these writers are always well informed and accurate, and abound in the pathos and humor that go to make up the life of the men of the sea. The following items from the St. John's Howler are some specimens of another class of literature that daily meets the eye. Local happenings. Deer were plentiful at Topsail and Quiddy Viddy last week. Ananias P. Slector of Providence, NY, shot a fine 72-pointer. Last night, the white steam car belonging to Mr. W. D. Speed ran into a New York drummer on Water Street. The car will have to go to Boston for repairs. In future, rotten potatoes will not be taken in lieu of monthly subscriptions. Cape Spear farmers, please note. Happiness and woe are ever joined together in this vale of tears. With the announcement of his election to the constituency of Dirty Bay comes news of the bankruptcy, for the second time, of our esteemed townsman, Mr. Charles Sculpin. Sculpin has had a checkered career, but now that he has drifted into the harbor of peaceful affluence, we trust that he will not forget his many long-suffering creditors. The life of Charles Sculpin should prove a striking object lesson to the rising youth of Newfoundland. The island, for without education or the possession of those advantages which are supposed to conduce to success in life, he has reached a high pinnacle of fame, and now his foot is on the ladder, he will not look back. There is some talk of making him Minister of Public Instruction. Another example of low thieving from our news column of last night occurs in the pages of the Terra Nova Express this morning. The incompetent ass who sits in the editorial chair of that dull rag will leap with joy when he learns that the item in question relating to the death of the Tsar of Russia was quite untrue and purposely inserted to expose his infamous pilfering. News comes from the Labrador of the safety of the Painter Glacier expedition, which left St. John's on the 10th of this month. After a 2-day stay in Battle Harbor, during which time they borrowed several boats and provisions from the missionaries of that place, the gallant explorers are returning in the Virginia Lake and hope to arrive this evening. 42 new lakes, 5 rivers, and 6 new mountain ranges were noted and charted, and the members of the expedition speak in the highest terms of the courtesy of the Hudson Bay Company. Major General Glacier. Arrangements for a lecture tour in the States are already in progress. Miss Clementina Codflakes, who has been visiting friends in town this week, returned to her home at Puzzle Through yesterday. Despite the universal impressions to the contrary, the editor of this paper is always prepared to accept cash on subscriptions. Owing to an unfortunate error, we referred in a recent issue to that admirable vocalist, Miss Bertie St. Hilaire, commonly known as Sure Death Bertie, and now on a visit to the island as a bony waiter, when it was obvious to the meanest intelligence that we meant Bonnie. Miss Bertie weighs somewhere about 17 stone, so she arrived at our office a bit flustered yesterday and demanded an explanation of our ungallant remarks. We need hardly say that Miss Birdie is far from being bony, and is a perfect lady in every respect. My canoes, bed, boxes of stores, and waterproof sheet were all in readiness, so, leaving St. John's by the accommodation train at 4 in the evening, I was turned out at Terra Nova Station in the darkness at 5 the next morning. Close to the line was a wooden building where a small boy of about 11 met me, rubbing his eyes. He said his name was Mike, and that he was the station master, his adopted father, one Tim, being section man of this part of the line. Mike, I found, was a bit of a character, and I much enjoyed his chatter and his views on the subject of Newfoundland in particular and life in general. "You'd like to see my friends," he said. "Yes, certainly," I replied, wondering who his friends could be in such an out-of-the-world corner. "Well, I'll bring them all term breakfast with you," he remarked drowsily, folding his arms under the telegraphic instrument and composing himself for a few hours' sleep. Poor child, he wanted it. Up 6 nights a week, and with a heavy weight of responsibility on his little shoulders. No wonder he was tired. We snatched 40 winks when a cheery voice from the door saying, "Glad you've come," woke me to see for the first time Bob Saunders and the handsome face of Jack Wells looking over his shoulder. It was nearly daylight by the time we had got all our kit down to the river bank and started the kettle for break fast. Then the boxes were broken open, and we soon had an excellent meal in preparation, whilst Jack Wells littered the whole stock of supplies on the bank preparatory to sorting it all carefully in bags for disposition in the 2 canoes. It is necessary, perhaps, to say a word or two about my guides. Robert Saunders is a sturdy little man of about 5 feet 6 inches, his face lined and beard gray, but there was also the unmistakable appearance that showed the man of vigor and energy in spite of his 55 years, which were all he would acknowledge. His manner was straightforward, and his eyes possessed the honest and sincere look of absolute truth which is always found in the best men accustomed to hardship and the constant struggle with the forces of nature. Little Bob had led a hard life, if any man ever had, in Newfoundland. In a country where toil in all weathers is the common lot, his life had been one of exceptional self-sacrifice, and what he had passed through was certainly beginning to tell on him. He had never spared himself, nor considered that he was more than some poor half-naked and hungry man, who was fishing, hunting, and packing and hunting in the woods in winter on wretched food will try the strongest man when we consider that they are constantly wet through and allow their wet clothes to dry on their bodies. Yet he had survived it all while many of his fellows had fallen on one side, and thanked God daily that he was so good to him in giving him food to eat and a little croft with a good wife down at Alexander Bay. I liked Saunders very much at once, and still more so when I got to know him and his single-hearted efforts to do everything in his power to ensure a pleasant time. Of a truth, he looked a bit shy at me one evening when I got out my notebook to snatch one of his entertaining stories for future digestion, and I hoped he wouldn't notice it. But after a bit he evidently considered this no bar to our conversation round the fire, and rattled away when in the mood. Jack Wells, too, was also a good fellow. He had a handsome, rather melancholy face with a low, quiet way of talking that was very nice to listen to and was both amiable and good-natured. I made a special point of this because 4 days straight on end, barking your shins and slipping off the greasy stones into the Terra Nova would try the temper of an angel, and not once during those 4 days did I hear Saunders or Wells swear or complain that the work was beyond their powers, but took the discomfort to be the common lot of man. There is a saying that to be uncomfortable without being unhappy, you must be either a philosopher or a woman with tight shoes. Yet neither Bob nor Jack were of this category. After the detestable fog of St. John's, it was a great delight to sit and sip one's tea in the pellucid clearness of an autumn morning, waking to the sun's warmth, incandescente sol aperuisset diem, as old Caesar poetically describes the dawn of day. The grey mists were drifting off the river lake and showing up the green woods in the distance, when a splendid herring gull came sailing up along the shore and pitched within 20 yards of us. His arrival was the signal for the appearance of the station master, who with sundry outcries to his various friends was approaching our temporary camp. His friends, I noticed, were all either four-footed, web-footed, for hurrying at his heels were two dingy-looking mongrels of undetermined species, a billy and two nanny goats, a sheep, another gull, and far in the rear, endeavoring to keep pace over the logs of an abandoned sawmill, 3 adipose ducks. Occasionally, Mike would stop and call to his strange family in various ways, and they hurried along according to the peculiar progression of each. It was a strange and pretty sight, and still more so when the herring gull, uttering his familiar wah 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 of his species, rose, flew up to the boy, and, with outstretched wings, ran before him to our fireside. "Well, I hope you've brought the entire menagerie, Mike," I said, as we offered to each some acceptable dainty. "Oh, yes," replied the boy with a sigh as he poured himself out a cup of tea. "They allus go with me everywhere, 'cept of course to trains. Trains is bad for birds. Goats and sheep can look after theirselves, but birds get kinda silly when you pets 'em. Thar was Dan, a big gull like Jack thar," pointing to the gray bird. "I had him for 3 year, and he'd most come to bed wi' me, but his wing was cut, as I feared he'd go away altogether. But one day that blamed fool of a no-account engine-man Bill Straw, what can't drive for nuts, run over him here in Turnover Station and cut his head off. I wouldn't ha' lost that bird for $10, and Bill said he'd get me 'nother go, but he never done it. Damn him." Little Mike sighed and expectorated reflectively. "How do you get the gulls, Mike?" I inquired. "Oh, there's plenty come to nest here summer time, but they're hard to rear. Jack there now I took when he warn't no bigger than a chicken, and though he goes away winter for a few weeks, he allus comes back in the spring with the old gray and white fellers. I've had him 3 years now, and he's a splendid catch. Here, Jack, catch," said the little fellow, flinging a piece of bacon rind high into the air. The sharp-eyed gull instantly floated aloft and caught the piece dexterously as it fell. "Tom Nowthar," continued my visitor, "he can't fly, as he's kinda crippled in one wing, but he's a great runner," and to show his skill, a piece of biscuit was hurled 20 yards away, to be instantly raced for, but Thomas, half running, half flying, proved an easy victor. Poor boy, they were about the only friends he had to talk to in all the comings and goings of the seasons, except when a passing hunter or fisherman came to beg an ounce of tobacco of the old section man. Mike helped us to stow the last of our packages aboard, and, wishing us good luck, we left behind the last trace of civilization in his lonely little figure, meditatively chucking rocks for the happy family to retrieve. The morning was beautifully fine with no wind, so we made good time with the canoes pushing along the river for some miles before we emerged into the large Terra Nova Lake, a fine sheet of water about 5 miles long and 1.5 across. We landed on a shingly beach to readjust some of the stores that were not riding well, and here I saw the fresh track of a small bear, the first sign of the wild game, always an inspiring sign to every hunter. At the west end of the lake, where the river comes in, we stopped and had dinner, and then on again up a dead stream for another 10 miles or so until sunset. In some places I had to land whilst the men dragged the canoes, and here we halted, and the men made a comfortable camp in a droke belt of spruce close to the water, and though wet to the waist they did not change their clothes, but lay down soaking as they were, and allowed the fire to steam the water out. Next day it was a case of walking up along the stones of the riverbed, while Saunders and Jack dragged the canoes through almost continuous rapids the whole day. To prevent the canoes and their contents from being upset, the men were constantly in the water hauling and easing the boats, whilst on the slippery rocks they kept frequently slittering and falling up to their middle the whole day. It was coarse work, and of a kind that none save those inured to hardship could stand. Just dog's work was Saunders' definition of the business. About midday I sat down by the side of the river to await the coming of the boats. They were close at hand when I heard Saunders shout, and looking upstream saw a fair-sized caribou stag rushing through the shallows about 150 yards away. My rifle lay resting against a bush, and by the time I had seized it, the chance was gone. After dinner, the riverbed became worse and worse, and the men had to spend all their time amongst very bad rocks, whilst in one part I had to take to the forest to get along. Newfoundland forest is not like that of any other country. It is principally composed of spruce and white pine, with a few larch, var, birch, dogwood, and maple scattered amongst them, and the trees, though not large, are placed so close together, and interspersed with so many fallen ones, that progress is excessively arduous. I was getting along pretty well when, chancing to stand on the top of a large fallen white pine, the bark suddenly gave way, and I was precipitated over a high rock onto the ground. Natural instinct compels one to save one's face with the arm and whatever it holds. Unfortunately, in this case, the Mannlicher rifle was the interposing object, with the result that the stock snapped clean off close to the action. This was disgusting, to say the least of it, before one had fired a shot. I had no other rifle, and for the moment I doubted my capacity to mend the weapon. Saunders, however, was nothing if not a man of resource, and after a protracted search in his voluminous pockets, he produced a screw nail about 1 inch long, and, with the aid of a tailor's needle straightened in the fire, we drilled a hole in the brittle walnut stalk and made a very fair mend of the broken weapon. This was lashed with string until we killed a caribou stag, when a piece of raw hide sewn tightly round the narrow part of the stalk made things as firm as ever. However, it gave me a lesson, and I shall not travel again without a spare rifle. In the evening, we reached the beautiful waterfall of the Terra Nova, where, after a stiff portage straight up the hill and through the forest, we made camp again near the upper river. The early part of the next day was especially hard on the men. The stream was so swift and rocky that the canoes had to be dragged every inch of the way for the 2 miles that intervened before Oligo Lake was reached. I, too, had no little difficulty in making way through the forest, for the deep water on the forest edge often forced me to take to the hillsides. Along this part of the stream I saw many fritillary butterflies, and at the entrance of Mollygojack Lake there was a fair number of birds. Belted kingfishers, gooseanders, red-breast mergansers, Canada geese, and yellow-shank sandpipers were occasionally moved on the river, whilst on the lakes of Mollygojack and St. John's I noticed a good many dusky ducks, Anas obscurus, the northern form of our mallard. Grebes, probably Sclavonians, interested me also. Great northern divers, buzzards, peregrine falcon, merlin, and for the first time the magnificent bald-headed eagle, or bird of Washington, made its appearance. In the woods we heard the rattle of, and occasionally saw the beautiful golden-winged and three-toed woodpeckers, whilst in camp at night the horned eagle-owl serenaded us with his melancholy hoots. Twice I flushed these big birds in the daytime, and they flopped slowly away as if disturbed out of a siesta. Sometimes as I crept through the wood at dawn, something would impel me to look up and meet a pair of great golden eyes that surveyed the intruder with intense disapproval. The hawk-owl, too, was sometimes seen perched on a withered tree, from which point of vantage he searched the ground for voles. As yet we had not met that delightfully cheeky fellow, the Canadian wood-jay, moose-bird, or whiskey-jack, as he is variously named, but of him more anon. Mollygojack Lake is a fine large sheet of water, roughly speaking about 20 miles round, and the surrounding forests are a great summer house of the woodland caribou. It has 1 or 2 pretty little islands, where the great northern divers evidently breed. I saw 2 females with young ones close to them, and it took us till evening to reach the western end, where we camped for the night. Here was plenty of fresh sign of caribou, but not too fresh, so we decided not to hunt, but to move on next day to St. John's Lake, on which our hopes were centered, at the camp where Selous had killed his deer. We made an early start the next day, August 28, up the 8 or 10 miles of Lake River, which separates Mollygojack from St. John's Lake, and which was only difficult for short distances. Our midday dinner was taken on the river about halfway, when shortly after restarting I saw something move behind a large rock on the left bank about 300 yards upstream. In another moment the head of a doe caribou appeared and again disappeared, so we rushed the canoe under the shelter of a projecting headland and I landed. After leaving Saunders and signaling to Jack to keep out of sight, I crawled up along the stones and immediately saw the doe standing in nearly the same spot. She was still 250 yards away, so to make sure of our meat, I took advantage of another miniature headland and crawled on to make a closer acquaintance. There was little cover, but the caribou took no precautions for her safety and allowed me to come within 80 yards without once raising her head for observation. A nice rock to shoot from presented itself at this corner, so, pressing the trigger, I had the satisfaction of seeing the deer drop dead in her tracks. On a fresh trip with new men, it is always a satisfactory thing to kill the first animal at which you fire, as it gives confidence to your followers and creates a favorable impression. So I took as much care over the easy shot at that wretched doe as if I was firing at a 50-pointer. We had some fresh meat now, and after photographing the animal, we cut it up and then paddled away in high spirits for St. John's Lake, which we reached about 5 o'clock. We had made good progress, but desired to complete the whole distance to the end of the lake before nightfall, so pressed on. On the way up the lake, we passed 4 more doe caribou gazing into the water, like some others of their sex, apparently lost in admiration of their loveliness as reflected by nature's mirror. One old lady allowed us to go by within 15 yards and seemed in no wise upset at our presence, as she had not got our wind. At last, our temporary Ultima Thule hove in sight, the river mouth at the west end, and I immediately recognized the Indian's observation tree, which Selous had told me to look out for, a gnarled and bent old white pine, standing out in picturesque solitude from the forest of spruce. As we moved up to the landing place, a caribou doe was wading in the shallows about 300 yards away. She swam slowly across the glassy river and after shaking herself like a great dog, wandered up into the timber right past the very spot where we were to make our home for a week. There is little doubt that a family party of Micmacs came annually to this corner of the lake and trapped during the winter. Next morning, Saunders and I, poking about in the forest close at hand, came on their house, which had been used during the past season. It was a carefully constructed tepee of spruce poles, beautifully lined inside with birch bark and quite impervious to rain or snow. We saw here, too, a large hollowed pine which had been cut out for a trough in which tanning had been made for curing caribou skins. Those skins had been then sewn together and used as a covering for a canoe. Saunders assumed that these were some of the regular hunting Indians, which come all the way from the south coast in the late fall. Later on in this work I give an account of the Micmacs, but a word or two about their predecessors may not be out of place. Recorded history enables us to go back as far only as the first appearance of European explorers who visited the island about 400 years ago. The Red Indians, or Beothics, were then the occupants of the soil, and they were said to resemble in every respect the indigenous tribes of North America, and were probably of the same stock as the Algonquins. The Beothics had straight black hair, high cheekbones, small black eyes, and a copper-colored skin. In hunting and fishing modes they also resembled the natives of the neighboring continent, and their weapons, wigwams, and domestic utensils were also similar. Ethnologists are not quite agreed as to the nature of their language, but it is generally accepted that they were probably a small branch of the warlike Algonquins, who at that time were the masters of the northeastern continent of Canada. Cabot landed on Newfoundland in 1497 and found the Beothics a numerous and powerful race. Having practically no enemies, and being naturally ingenious and gentle-mannered, he found them extremely friendly and anxious to show the white voyagers any hospitality. The rivers and seas of the country at that time swarmed with fish, and through the forests and barrens the countless herds of caribou roamed in comparative security. Consequently, the Indians practiced no agriculture, but lived a life of, to an Indian, great luxury without the necessity of any form of toil. But after a short few years of peace, the same old story was repeated here, as everywhere in the world, where the white man comes and wishes to make the country all his own. Quarrels arose between the whites and the reds, followed by the usual deeds of violence, and a bitter enmity that could only end in the ultimate extermination of one race or the other. As usual, too, the white man, with his superior brains and superior weapons of destruction, had the best of it. Yet the Beothics held out through some 300 years, during which time they were often treated with the greatest brutality, which was as frequently returned with equal savagery. When the white men had at length exterminated 2/3 of the Indians, they became filled with a commendable spirit of conciliation, and from 1760 to 1823 many attempts were made to live on friendly terms with the men of the woods. But it was too late. Experience had taught them to hate the white man with a deadly hatred, and they now, after centuries of war, found it impossible to accept any advances of kindness. Broken and in despair, the last of the Beothics retreated to the shores of Red Indian Lake, where they perished slowly one by one till not a single member was left. It is necessary to say a few words concerning the first writer upon the Beothics. Captain Richard Whitbourne of Exmouth, after having served as captain of his own ship against the Spanish Armada in 1588, made many voyages to Newfoundland for the purpose of fishing and establishing colonies there. He made his first voyage to that country in 1583, with the intention of trading with the savage people and killing whales. He says of it, "But this intended voyage was overthrown by the indiscretion of our captain and faint-heartednesses of some gentlemen of our company. Whereupon we set sail from thence and bare into Trinity Harbor in Newfoundland, where we killed great store of fish, deer, bears, beavers, seals, otters, and such like, with abundance of sea-fowl, and so returning for England, we arrived safe at Southampton." On his second voyage in 1586, the gallant captain had the command of a worthy ship set forth by one Master Crook of Southampton. He witnessed the taking possession of Newfoundland by Sir Humphrey Gilbert in the name of Queen Elizabeth. After this he made many interesting voyages to Newfoundland. One of the most striking passages in his book relates to his meeting and detention by the famous arch-pirate Peter Easton, whom I did persuade much to desist from his evil course. It is interesting to note that in 1608 one of Captain Whitbourne's ships was intercepted. A discourse and discovery of Newfoundland, with many reasons to prove how worthy and beneficial a plantation may there be made after a far better manner than now it is, together with the laying open of certain enormities and abuses committed by some that trade to that country, and the means laid down for reformation thereof, by Captain Richard Whitbourne of Exmouth in the county of Devon, unimprinted at London by Felix Kingston, for William Barrett, 1620, dedicated to King James I. Whitbourne under the title of Westward Ho for the Newfoundland, Thomas by an English airing captain that went forth with Sir Walter Raleigh. The distinction between an arch pirate and an English airing captain does not seem to be very clear. Another point in this quaint book which he wrote upon his travels is of great interest to naturalists, for it refers to the great auk, Alca impennis, now, alas, extinct, but which formerly existed in great numbers on Funk Island, off the northeast coast of Newfoundland. These birds were always known as penguins by the inhabitants, and I once met an old fisherman whose father possessed a stuffed specimen. He himself used to ride on the back of the bird as a little boy, little knowing that within his lifetime such things would be worth 400 and 500 pounds. These penguins, says Captain Whitbourne, are as big as geese and fly not, for they have but a little short wing, and they multiply so infinitely upon a certain flat island that men drive them from thence upon a board into their boats by hundreds at a time, as if God had made the innocence of so poor a creature to become such an admirable instrument for the sustentation of man. He thus describes the Beothics and their habits. For it is well known that the natives of those parts have great store of red ochre, wherewith they use to colour their bodies, bows, arrows, and canoes, in a painting manner, which canoes are their boats, that they use to go to sea in, which are built in shape like the wherries on the river of Thames, with small timbers, no thicker nor heard of, could say that any wolf, leopard, bear, or any other beasts, did ever set upon any man or boy in the Newfoundland, although divers times some men have been by themselves in the woods, when they have suddenly come near unto them, and those beasts have presently upon sight of any Christian speedily run from them. Later he gives some particulars of utensils, weapons, canoes used by the Indians. For it is well known that the natives of those parts have great store of red ochre, wherewith they use to colour their bodies, bows, arrows, and canoes, in a painting manner, which canoes are their boats, that they use to go to sea in, which are built in shape like the wherries on the river of Thames, with small timbers, no thicker nor broader than hoops, and instead boards they use the bark of birch trees, which they sew very artificially and close together, and overlay the seams of ships and boats, and in like manner they used to sew the bark of spruce and fir trees, round and deep in proportion like a brass kettle, to boil their meat in, as it hath been well approved by divers men, but most especially to my certain knowledge by 3 mariners of a ship of Tapson in the county of Devon. which ship riding there at anchor nearby me at the harbor called Heartsease, on the north side of Trinity Bay, and being robbed in the night by the savages of their apparel and divers other provisions, did the next day seek after them, and happened to come suddenly where they had set up 3 tents, and were feasting, having 3 such canoes by them, and 3 pots made of such rinds of trees, standing each of them on 3 stones boiling, with 12 fowls in each of them, every fowl as big as a good duck. They had also many such pots, so sewed and fashioned like leather buckets, that are used for quenching of fire, and those were full of the yolks of eggs, that they had taken and boiled hard, and so dried small as it had been powder sugar, which the savages used in their broth, as sugar is often used in some meat. They had great store of the skins of deers, beavers, bears, seals, otters, and divers other fine skins, which were excellent well dressed, as also great store of several sorts of flesh dried, and by shooting off a musket towards them, they all ran away naked, without any apparel, but only some of them had their hats on their heads, which were made of seal skins, in fashion like our hats, sewed handsomely, with narrow bands about them set round with fine white shells. All their 3 canoes, their flesh, skins, yolks of eggs, targets, bows and arrows, and much fine ochre, and divers other things they took and brought to me the best canoe. Captain Whitbourne tells us that in 1622 the distribution of the Beothics was over the northwest parts of the island, and on the east side as far south as Trinity Bay. 200 years later, when Cormac wrote, the Indians had retired altogether from White Bay, Green Bay, and the east coast, but were still in the north and central parts. Whitbourne states that in his time the ships did not fish in Trinity Bay, partly on account of the rocky ledges, but chiefly because the savage people of that country do there inhabit. Many of them secretly every year come into Trinity Bay and harbor in the night time, purposely to steal sails, lines, hatchets, hooks, knives, and such like. On page 2, Whitbourne says, "The natural inhabitants of the country, as they are but few in number, so are they something rude and savage people, having neither knowledge of God, nor living under any kind of civil government. In their habits, customs, and manners they resemble the Indians of the continent, from whence, I suppose, they come. They live all together in the north and west part of the country, which is seldom frequented by the English. But the French and Biscaynes, who resort thither yearly for the whale fishing and also for the codfish, report them to be an ingenious and tractable people, being well used. They are ready to assist them with great labor and patience in the killing, cutting, and boiling of whales and making oil, without expectation of other reward than a little bread or some such small hire." Later, Lieutenant John Cartwright, a brother of the famous Captain Cartwright of Labrador, was sent on an expedition up the Exploits River in 1768, and obtained a little information of the habits of the Red Indians. Soon after this, Captain Buchan went twice up the Exploits to Red Indian Lake, and on the first occasion had 2 of his marines killed. In the winter of 1810, Captain Buchan forced an interview with the Beothics on Red Indian Lake. Hostages were exchanged, But on the captain retiring to bring up some presents which he had left at a depot, the Indians became suspicious, fearing he had gone to obtain reinforcements with which to surround and capture them. In consequence, they murdered the 2 white men that had remained in their hands and retired into the interior. Captain Buchan was mystified to find that the Indians had departed on his return, and the whole story was not made clear until 1828, when the particulars were explained by Shaunawdithit. In the year 1828, there was a society in St. John's known as the Beothic Institution, whose business it was to communicate with and, if possible, civilize the Red Indians, as well as to ascertain the habits and history of that unhappy race of people. The president was W. E. Cormack, who took a kindly interest in the fate of the Indians, and who became so interested in them that he undertook a journey to Red Indian Lake for the purpose of establishing communication with the red men. On October 31, 1828, he entered the country at the north of the exploits in company with 3 Indians, an Abenaki from Canada, a mountaineer from Labrador, and a Micmac from the south coast of Newfoundland. He took a northwesterly route to Hall's Bay, which he reached in 8 days, passing the country interior from New Bay, Badger Bay, and Seal Bay, a district well known as the summer resort of the Indians. On the 4th day, he found traces of the savages in the shape of canoe rests, spear shafts, and rinded vars, this people using the inner part of the bark of that kind of tree for food. On the lakes near New Bay were the remains of winter mamatiques or wigwams, each intended to hold from 6 to 20 people. Close to these were oblong pits about 4 feet deep, designed to preserve stores, etc., some of them being lined with birch rind. In his report, Cormack mentions the peculiar vapor baths of which he also found traces at this place, and whose use was afterwards explained to him by Shaunawdithit. The method used by the Beothics to raise the steam was by pouring water on large stones made very hot for the purpose, in the open air, by burning a quantity of wood around them. After this process, the ashes were removed, and a hemispherical framework, closely covered with skins to exclude the external air, was fixed over the stones. The patient then crept in under the skins, taking with him a birch-rind bucket of water and a small bark dish to dip it out, which, by pouring on the stones, enabled him to raise the steam at pleasure. Shaunawdithit explained that the steam bath was only used by old and rheumatic people. After traversing the country on the highlands south of White Bay without finding further traces of the Indians, whom he had expected to encounter near the passes of the deer now in full migration, Cormack traveled to Red Indian Lake, but to his great disappointment he found it had been deserted for some years by the Indians, after being tormented by Europeans for the last 18 years. After further search on the Exploits River, Cormack returned to the north on November 29 without having seen a single Red Indian. Among other interesting relics of these people which Cormack presented to the Beothic Institution was a vocabulary of the Beothic language consisting of 200 to 300 words. This was supposed to have been given by Cormack to a Dr. Yates, but I have failed to trace the list or the descendants of the recipient, which would go far to prove the Beothics to be a distinct tribe from any hitherto discovered in North America. During his stay at Red Indian Lake, Cormac found many recent traces of the Beothics which show their modes of life, treatment of the dead, methods of hunting deer. One difference, he says, between the Beothic wigwams and those of other Indians is that in most of the former there are small hollows, like nests, dug in the earth around the fireplace, one for each person to sit in. These hollows are generally so close together, and also so close to the fireplace and to the sides of the wigwam, that I think it probable these people have been accustomed to sleep in a sitting position. He also found a large, handsome birch-rind canoe, about 22 feet in length, comparatively new. In its construction, iron nails had been used, doubtless stolen from the white settlers. John Hinks, a half-breed Micmac who was present when several of the old wigwam sites were unearthed, has told me that the floors of these abodes were sunk a foot or two beneath the ground, which was polished smooth and had turf seats. On this floor the family slept and kept their fire alight, one member always being deputed to keep watch. The lower part of the skin covering was raised from the ground, and all vegetation removed for a considerable distance, so that in case of surprise the Indians could bend low without fear of being seen or shot, and send a flight of arrows at any invader. Their cleverness is shown by the way in which they constructed their retreat. A tunnel, sometimes 30 and 40 yards long, was burrowed from the wigwam into the woods, and by this means the Indians retired when the fight went against them. They used pots of iron and a few other simple utensils. Their wooden repositories for the dead, says Cormac, are what are in the most perfect state of preservation. These are of different constructions, it would appear, according to the character or rank of the persons entombed. In one of them, which resembled a hut 10 feet by 8 or 9, and 4 or 5 feet high in the center, floored with squared poles, the roof covered with rinds of trees, and in every way well seasoned against the weather inside and the intrusion of wild beasts, there were 2 grown persons laid out at full length on the floor, the bodies wrapped round with deerskins. One of these bodies appeared to have been placed here not longer ago than 5 or 6 years. Cormac's most surprising discovery in one of these dead houses was a white deal affair, containing a skeleton neatly shrouded in white muslin. After a long pause of conjecture how such a thing existed here, the idea of Mary March occurred to one of the party, and the whole mystery was at once explained. In the cemetery were deposited alongside the bodies 2 small wooden images of a man and a woman, doubtless meant to represent husband and wife, also a small doll, a pathetic emblem of Mary March's child, which died 2 days after the capture of its mother. Several small models of canoes, 2 small models of boats, an iron axe, a bow and quiver of arrows, birch-rind cooking utensils, and 2 firestones, radiated iron pyrites, from which the Beothics produced fire by striking them together. Another mode of sepulture described by Cormac was for the body of the deceased to be wrapped in birch rind, with his property placed on a sort of scaffold about 4 feet from the ground, in a manner still employed by some of the Western American tribes. A third method was to bend the body together and enclose it in a kind of box laid on the ground, and a fourth to simply wrap. Mary March, so called from the name of the month in which she was taken, was a Red Indian woman who was captured at Mary's Brook near Red Indian Lake by an armed party of Newfoundlanders in March 1819. This was the immediate result of the governor's offer of a reward to any persons who would bring him a Red Indian. The party came upon 3 Indians, a man and 2 women, several attempts, single-handed, to secure her from the captains in distance of their firearms and fixed bayonets. The body of the man was found bound behind her wife in one of the cemeteries at Red Indian Lake. The following winter the Indians left the lake to take back this woman to the lake where she was captured, and if possible at the same time to open friendly intercourse with her tribe. But the dish on board Captain Buchan's vessel at the mouth of the river, wherein Buchan himself had slept, was stolen by one of the boat's crew. When her people left where they were afterwards most likely to meet with it, it appears the Indians were this winter encamped on the banks of the river Exploits, and their encampment in consequence, and some weeks afterwards went a circuitous route to the lake to ascertain what the party had been doing there. They found Mary March's body had been removed from where Captain Buchan had left it. Some it now lies by the side of her husband, the body in birch rind, and cover it with a heap of stones. Cormac thus describes the long deer fences made by the Beothics, and their method of killing the caribou. On the north side of the lake, opposite the river Exploits, are the extremities of 2 deer fences, about half a mile apart, where they lead to the water. It is understood that they diverge many miles in northwesterly directions. The Red Indians make these fences to lead and scare the deer to the lake during the periodical migration of these animals, the Indians being stationed looking out when the deer get into the water to swim across, the lake being narrow at this end. They attack and kill the animals with spears out of their canoes. In this way, they secure their winter provisions before the severity of that season sets in. What arrests the attention most while gliding down the stream, the Exploits, is the extent of the Indian fences to entrap the deer. They extend from the lake downwards, continuous on the banks of the river, at least 30 miles. There are openings left here and there in them for the animals to go through and swim across the river, and at these places the Indians are stationed and kill them in the water with spears out of their canoes, as at the lake. Here, then, connecting these fences with those on the northwest side of the lake, is at least 40 miles of country, easterly and westerly, prepared to intercept the deer that pass that way in their periodical migrations. It was melancholy to contemplate the gigantic yet feeble efforts of a whole primitive nation in their anxiety to provide subsistence forsaken and going to decay. A Red Indian woman named Shaunawdithit was living near the Exploits River with some white people at this time, and through the interest of the Beothic institution she was sent to St. John's. As the final words of Chapter 1 from Newfoundland and its Untrodden Ways fade into the misty horizon. Let the gentle roll of ocean waves lull you toward tranquil shores. In this salty embrace of the sea, drift into slumber's calm harbor, where dreams sail softly under starlit skies. Good night from salty slumber stories. Rest easy, weary mariners, until our next nautical tale unfolds. Sleep deep, and let the tides carry you peacefully.